Just outside Brussels lies one of the most chilling reminders of Nazi terror on Belgian soil, Fort Breendonk. Originally built as a military fortress to defend Belgium in the early 20th century, it took on a much darker role during World War II. Under Nazi occupation, this massive concrete structure was transformed into a detention and transit camp where resistance fighters, political prisoners, and Jews were imprisoned, tortured, and humiliated. Today, Fort Breendonk stands as a powerful memorial, not just to those who suffered here, but to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of brutality. Join me as we walk through its heavy gates and uncover the harrowing stories etched into its cold stone walls. Fort Breendonk is a former military installation which served as a Nazi prison camp during the German occupation of Belgium during World War II. Originally constructed between 1906 and 1913 as part of the Second Ring of 1945, the National Redoubt defending Antwerp, Fort Breendonk was used by the Belgian army and was covered by a 5-meter-thick layer of soil for defense against artillery fire, a water-filled moat, and measured 656 by 984 feet. It was used in both World War I and World War II, by which time it had become militarily obsolete. Fort Breendonk was requisitioned by the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, shortly after the Belgian surrender on 28 May 1940, and used as a prison camp for the detention of political prisoners, resistance members, and Jews. Although technically a prison rather than a concentration camp, it became infamous for the poor living conditions in which the prisoners were housed and for the torture and executions which were carried out there. Most detainees were subsequently transferred to larger concentration camps in Eastern Europe. 3,590 prisoners are known to have been held at Fort Breendonk during the war, of whom 303 died or were executed in the fort itself, while 1,741 others subsequently died in other camps before the end of the war. In Belgian historical memory, Breendonk became symbolic of the barbarity of the German occupation. The camp was evacuated ahead of the liberation of Belgium by the Allies of World War II in September 1944. It was briefly repurposed to detain Belgian collaborators. It was declared a national memorial in 1947 and has subsequently been opened to the public as a museum. Many of the camp's personnel were subsequently tried for their wartime actions in Belgian courts. On the 20th of September 1940, the first prisoners arrived. Initially, most of the prisoners were petty criminals, people deemed antisocial, or who did not conform to the German race laws. Later on, resistance fighters, political prisoners, and ordinary people captured as hostages were detained as well. Another section was used as a transit camp for Jews being sent to death camps in Eastern Europe, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau. Between 3,500 and 3,600 prisoners were incarcerated in Breendonk during its existence, of whom 1,733 died before liberation. About 400 to 500 were Jews. Most of the non-Jewish prisoners were left-wing members of the Belgian resistance or were held as hostages by the Germans. In September 1941, the Belgian communist prisoners held at Breendonk were deported to Neuengamme concentration camp. Jewish prisoners in Breendonk were segregated from other prisoners until 1942. Thereafter, Jews were transferred to the nearby Mechelen transit camp and deported to the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. Upon arrival at the camp, new inmates were brought to the courtyard, where they would have to stand facing the wall until they were processed into the camp. They were forbidden to move, and any motion was severely punished. In the camp, punishment consisted of beatings, torture in the old gunpowder magazine, hanging, or execution by firing squad. Inmates were forced to watch any executions that took place. All the prisoners were subjected to forced labor. The camp authorities wanted the earth that had covered much of the fort to be removed and shifted to build a high bank around the camp to hide it from outside view. In the few years Fort Breendonk was used by the Nazis, 250,000 cubic meters of soil covering the fort were removed by the prisoners by hand at a grueling pace. Prisoners only had hand tools to complete this enormous task, and the soil had to be transported to the outer wall via hand carts on a narrow-gauge railway system. The ground in the camp was often very soggy, causing the rails to sink away in the mud. Prisoners were then expected to move by hand the carts filled with dirt, pushing and dragging them back and forth over a distance of more than 300 meters. This regime was imposed for over 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, even in the worst of weather conditions. The living conditions inside Fort Breendonk were harsh and dehumanizing. Prisoners were crammed into overcrowded dormitories, where they slept on hard wooden bunks or, in many cases, directly on the cold concrete floor. There was no heating, and the damp air seeped through the thick fortress walls, making nights unbearable, especially during the winter. The prison cells, some barely large enough for a person to lie down, were used for solitary confinement or punishment. These dark, suffocating spaces were designed to mentally and physically break the inmates. Many still bear the faint scratches and inscriptions made by prisoners clinging to hope. Adjacent to the sleeping areas were the wash basins, little more than a row of crude sinks with icy water and no privacy. Prisoners were allowed only brief moments to wash under strict supervision, and sanitary conditions were appalling. The lack of hygiene led to widespread lice infestations and illness, compounding the suffering already inflicted by starvation, forced labor, and constant fear. The food provided to prisoners at Fort Breendonk was meager, nutritionally inadequate, and deliberately dehumanizing. Inmates were typically given a thin, watery soup once or twice a day, often made from rotting vegetables or potato peels. The so-called bread ration was a coarse, black loaf, sometimes shared among several prisoners, and frequently moldy or stale. Meat was extremely rare, and when it was offered, it was often unidentifiable scraps. The portions were intentionally small, not enough to sustain the prisoners through the long hours of forced labor they endured daily. Malnutrition quickly took hold, leaving prisoners weak, vulnerable to disease, and less able to resist the physical and psychological abuse inflicted by the guards. Hunger was a constant torment, and many inmates were reduced to fighting over scraps or trading precious belongings for a bite more to eat. The food system at Breendonk was not just about sustenance. It was another tool of control, humiliation, and slow degradation. This video shows the daily life of the prisoners at Fort Breendonk.
Stilgestanden! Links! Rechts hinten zu Wasser! Marsch! Schneller, ihr Saufkerle! Schneller! Ihr Saufkerle! Schneller! Schneller! Hört ihr nicht, was ich sage? Schneller! Das reicht! Team, schneller arbeiten, habe ich gesagt. Weiter! Häftlinge, richt euch!
Herr Oberfeldwebel, ik meld u gehoorzaam die stuur 4 met 48 afdelingen.
Nummer 7, aufstellen! Sit kommen! Schnell!
The torture room inside Fort Breendonk stands as one of the most grim and oppressive spaces within the fort, a place where the SS and their collaborators carried out brutal interrogations. This room was used to extract information, punish dissent, and break the will of the prisoners. It is a small, stark chamber with bare walls and minimal furnishings, emphasizing the starkness of the horrors it held. Prisoners were subjected to physical torture, including beatings, electric shocks, and other methods of cruelty. These brutal practices were intended not only to force confessions, but to destroy the prisoner's sense of dignity and humanity. The shower room was a cold, austere place, where prisoners were often herded in quickly and given only a brief moment to wash. The water was freezing, and the showers themselves were basic, with no privacy or warmth to offer any comfort. These brief moments of washing did little to alleviate the grim reality of their surroundings, and hygiene was a luxury that most could not maintain in such harsh conditions. For many, the cold showers were a daily reminder of their helplessness, their bodies treated as little more than objects to be used and discarded. Nearby, the latrines were equally horrifying, rows of open, unsanitary toilets with no privacy, where prisoners had to relieve themselves in front of each other. These filthy, exposed latrines were a breeding ground for disease, and the lack of basic sanitation caused many to suffer from dysentery and other illnesses. The stench of human waste filled the air, further adding to the psychological and physical torment the prisoners endured. The latrines were a constant reminder of their lost dignity, where even their most basic needs were treated with neglect and contempt. The execution area was a place where lives were extinguished without mercy, where fear and despair weighed heavily on the souls of those brought to their deaths. Of the 300 prisoners that died in the camp itself, 185 were executed. Many of the rest died of torture, disease, or exposure. Most of those that did survive were transported to concentration camps. You can also see the stable, pig house, and blacksmith shop at Fort Breendonk that offer further insight into the daily life of the camp and the forced labor imposed on prisoners. These areas were not merely functional, but also served as tools of control and oppression. Dear friends, as we walk through the somber halls and quiet courtyards of Fort Breendonk, it's impossible not to feel the weight of history and the suffering that unfolded within these walls. This place, once a site of unimaginable cruelty, now stands as a powerful memorial to the lives lost, the resilience of those who endured, and the inhumanity of the Nazi occupation. Fort Breendonk serves not only as a reminder of the past, but also as a call to ensure that such horrors are never forgotten and that we continue to honor the memory of those who suffered here. The walls of this fortress are etched with stories of pain, defiance, and hope, a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of tyranny. May we always remember, and may we never let history repeat itself. See you soon with another video on Beauty of the World. Safe travels.